On the morning of July 6, 1973, an 11-year-old girl left her home for what should have been an ordinary walk to summer school. She carried her books. She followed the same familiar route. She was only a few blocks away from the place she was supposed to be. But Linda O'Keefe never arrived. Within minutes, an ordinary Friday morning in Newport Beach, California, became one of the city's most haunting mysteries. Someone had taken an 11-year-old child in broad daylight. Parents began searching. Neighbors joined in. Police officers flooded the streets. Yet Linda seemed to have vanished without leaving behind a single answer. For years, then decades, the question remained the same. Who stopped Linda O'Keefe on her way to school? And why did it take 45 years before investigators finally learned the truth? This is not simply the story of a cold case. It is the story of a family that never stopped waiting, a police department that never stopped believing, and scientific advances that finally gave a voice to evidence collected generations earlier. Because sometimes, justice doesn't disappear. Sometimes, it simply waits. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments. Someone watching may remember this case or another that changed their community forever. Linda Ann O'Keefe was born into a close-knit family in Southern California. Friends and relatives described her as cheerful, responsible, and mature for her age. She enjoyed spending time with her siblings and friends, and like many children her age, she was looking forward to summer activities, even while attending summer school. In the early 1970s, Newport Beach was widely viewed as a safe coastal community. Children regularly walked or rode their bicycles to school without concern. Parents knew their neighbors. Streets were familiar. It was the kind of place where people believed children could safely travel short distances on their own. Linda's family shared that confidence. There was nothing unusual about her walking to school that Friday morning. She had done it before. Her school was only a short distance from home. The route was familiar. Nothing suggested danger was waiting. On the morning of July 6, 1973, Linda left home carrying her school materials and began walking toward Lincoln Intermediate School, where summer classes were being held. Investigators later determined she was last seen walking along 14th Street in Newport Beach. Witnesses reported seeing an unknown light-colored vehicle in the area around the time she disappeared. According to investigators, Linda never reached the school campus. When she failed to arrive, concern quickly spread. School officials notified her family. Before long, everyone understood that this was far more serious than a child arriving late for class. Linda had disappeared during a routine walk in broad daylight. Police immediately began searching the neighborhood. Officers retraced her route. Residents were interviewed. Nearby streets, vacant lots, and surrounding areas were examined for any sign of the missing 11-year-old. As the hours passed without answers, concern turned into urgency. The Newport Beach Police Department expanded the search. Volunteers joined officers. Community members searched on foot. Others drove through nearby neighborhoods hoping to spot Linda or anyone matching witness descriptions. Every passing hour increased investigators' fears. Then, later that same day, the search ended in tragedy. Linda's body was discovered in a field near Back Bay Drive, several miles from where she had disappeared. Investigators determined she had been murdered. Out of respect for Linda and her family, authorities released only limited details regarding the forensic findings. Their immediate priority became identifying the person responsible. The crime shocked Newport Beach. Residents struggled to understand how an 11-year-old child could disappear during a short walk to school in such a well-known neighborhood. Parents who had once allowed children to walk alone suddenly questioned whether their community was as safe as they had believed. Detectives began one of the largest homicide investigations in the city's history. Every possible witness was interviewed. Evidence was carefully collected. Investigators followed every lead available to them. At the time, they could not know that some of the evidence they preserved would remain silent for more than 4 decades before finally revealing the truth. For Linda's family, life would never be the same. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering would forever include the absence of an 11-year-old girl who never came home from school. The years would continue moving forward, but the questions would remain. Who had taken Linda? Who had ended her life? And would justice ever come? Now that you've learned who Linda O'Keefe was, does her story remind you of someone you knew growing up? Share a respectful thought in the comments. Remembering Linda as a person, not just a case, helps keep her story alive. The discovery of Linda O'Keefe's body changed everything. Only hours earlier, police had been searching for a missing child. Now, they were investigating the murder of an 11-year-old girl. For the Newport Beach Police Department, every minute suddenly became even more critical. Investigators immediately secured the area where Linda was found. Crime scene technicians carefully documented every detail. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, physical evidence was collected using the forensic standards available in 1973. Even then, detectives understood that the smallest piece of evidence could one day identify a killer. What they could not know was that some of that evidence would wait 45 years before science finally unlocked its secrets. Detectives began reconstructing Linda's final known movements. They interviewed classmates, teachers, neighbors, motorists, anyone who might have seen her during the short walk to summer school. Witnesses described seeing Linda walking along her usual route that morning. Several people also reported noticing a light-colored vehicle in the area around the time she disappeared. At that stage of the investigation, police could not determine whether the driver had any connection to the crime. Nevertheless, every sighting was documented. Every statement was preserved. The investigation expanded rapidly. Roadblocks were considered. Law enforcement agencies throughout Orange County received information about the case. Tips poured in from members of the public. Some believed they had seen suspicious vehicles. Others reported unfamiliar individuals in nearby neighborhoods. Each lead required investigators to verify the information before moving to the next. As newspaper headlines spread across Southern California, fear quickly followed. Parents who had once allowed children to walk to school alone suddenly changed their routines. Schools reminded students never to speak with strangers. Neighborhood watch efforts increased. Linda's murder had shattered a sense of safety that many families had taken for granted. Meanwhile, detectives focused on the evidence, the crime scene, witness interviews, potential suspects. Every avenue was explored. Investigators also examined whether Linda's murder might be connected to other violent crimes committed in California. They compared reports, reviewed similarities, contacted neighboring jurisdictions. But despite months of work, no suspect emerged. No arrest followed. The investigation continued. Weeks became months. Months became years. The file grew larger. Every interview, every photograph, every laboratory report, every witness statement was preserved. That decision would eventually become one of the most important reasons the case could still be solved decades later. Now that you know who Linda O'Keefe was and how quickly investigators responded, what stands out to you most about those first crucial hours? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Keeping Linda's story alive helps ensure she is remembered as more than just a case file. As time passed, the investigation became increasingly difficult. Witness memories faded. People moved away. Businesses closed. The route Linda had walked changed with new development. Some evidence available in 1973 could never be recreated. Yet detectives refused to classify the case as forgotten. Every few years, fresh investigators reopened the file. They reviewed interviews from the beginning, looked again at physical evidence, re-examined witness statements that had once seemed insignificant. Cold case investigations often depend on patience. Sometimes a single overlooked detail becomes important decades later. Sometimes new technology transforms old evidence into new answers. The detectives assigned to Linda's case understood that possibility. Instead of discarding evidence that could not yet be fully analyzed, they preserved it, carefully, methodically, without realizing it. They were protecting the future of the investigation. In the 1970s, DNA profiling did not exist. Fingerprint analysis, witness interviews, and physical evidence formed the foundation of criminal investigations. If biological evidence was collected, investigators often had no scientific method capable of identifying the individual who left it. Still, evidence technicians stored those materials. They followed chain of custody procedures. They documented everything. Those careful decisions would eventually become the difference between an unsolved case and an identified killer. For Linda's family, the years continued moving forward. Birthdays arrived, holidays came and went. Every milestone carried the painful reminder that Linda should have been there. While investigators searched for answers, her family waited, hoping that someday, someone would finally tell them who had taken their daughter on that summer morning in 1973. The wait would become one of the longest in California criminal history. But the investigation was far from over. As the months became years, the investigation into Linda O'Keefe's murder entered a difficult new phase. The immediate search was over. The crime scene had been processed. Hundreds of interviews had been conducted. Every promising lead had been followed. Yet one question remained unanswered. Who killed Linda O'Keefe? For detectives with the Newport Beach Police Department, closing the case was never an option. Although public attention gradually faded, investigators continued reviewing evidence whenever new information surfaced. Each tip was evaluated. Each potential suspect was examined, but none could be connected to the crime strongly enough to support criminal charges. The years continued to pass. New detectives inherited the investigation from those who had originally worked the case in 1973. Boxes of reports, photographs, evidence logs, witness statements, everything was preserved. Cold case investigators often described their work as continuing a conversation started by detectives decades earlier. Every note written in 1973 could still matter. Every preserved piece of evidence still held the possibility of revealing something science could not explain at the time. That belief kept Linda's case alive. During the 1980s and 1990s, forensic science began changing criminal investigations across the United States. DNA profiling emerged as one of the most significant advances in modern policing. Cases once thought impossible to solve suddenly had new possibilities. Across the country, investigators reopened evidence collected years earlier. Some cases produced DNA profiles, others did not. Newport Beach detectives carefully reviewed Linda's case to determine whether modern forensic testing could help identify her killer. Evidence collected in 1973 was submitted for updated laboratory analysis as technology improved. Each advancement offered renewed hope. But identifying a DNA profile is only one part of solving a crime. The profile must also match a known individual. Years passed without that match. Traditional law enforcement DNA databases did not identify the unknown person connected to the evidence. For Linda's family, the absence of answers became part of everyday life. Birthdays continued. Family gatherings continued. Yet Linda's place remained empty. The passage of time never diminished the loss. For investigators, that reality reinforced why the case remained active. Justice delayed was not justice abandoned. As the investigation continued into the 21st century, another scientific breakthrough began changing cold case investigations: investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA databases, this technique allows investigators, working within legal and ethical guidelines, to identify possible relatives of an unknown suspect through genealogy research. Rather than searching only for an exact DNA match, investigators search for family connections. Those family trees are then carefully reconstructed using public records, historical documents, and additional investigative work. The process is slow, complex, and often requires months, or even years, of research. But in several major cold cases across the United States, it had already produced remarkable results. Newport Beach investigators believed Linda's case might also benefit. They partnered with forensic specialists experienced in investigative genetic genealogy. The preserved DNA evidence from 1973 became the starting point. Scientists generated a DNA profile. Genealogists began building family trees. Generation after generation, branch after branch, the search gradually narrowed. Investigators examined historical records, birth certificates, marriage records, military records, census information. Every document helped eliminate possibilities and move closer to one individual. The work required extraordinary patience. Unlike television dramas, breakthroughs rarely happen overnight. Cold case investigations are built upon thousands of small discoveries, rather than one dramatic revelation. Months passed, then more months. Finally, The genealogy research pointed investigators toward one man, James Allen Neal. Detectives immediately began working to confirm whether Neal could be connected to Linda's murder through additional evidence. Identification through genealogy alone was not enough. Investigators needed independent confirmation before publicly naming anyone. They quietly continued the investigation. Carefully, methodically, without alerting the suspect. The case that had remained unsolved for more than 45 years was approaching its most important moment. For 45 years, Linda O'Keefe's family waited while detectives protected evidence they hoped one day would speak. If you've ever seen a case solved decades later, what role do you think modern DNA has played in giving families long-awaited answers? Share your thoughts respectfully below. Investigators now believed they finally knew where to look, but they still needed one final piece of evidence. One final confirmation. Without it, 45 years of work could not become justice. The breakthrough was closer than anyone imagined. For more than 45 years, the answer had remained hidden, not because detectives had stopped looking, not because evidence had disappeared, but because the technology needed to identify Linda O'Keefe's killer simply did not exist in 1973. Now, it finally did. The Newport Beach Police Department partnered with forensic specialists to apply investigative genetic genealogy to the preserved DNA evidence collected during the original investigation. The process was unlike anything detectives could have imagined decades earlier. Instead of searching only for an exact DNA match in criminal databases, scientists searched for distant biological relatives. Those relatives became the starting point for an enormous genealogical investigation. Family trees stretched across generations. Public records were examined. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, military records, obituaries, census documents. Every record eliminated possibilities until investigators began focusing on one family. Eventually, the investigation identified James Allen Neal as the person most likely connected to the DNA evidence. But investigators understood something important. Genetic genealogy provides direction. It does not replace criminal evidence. Before anyone could be publicly identified, detectives needed confirmation through traditional forensic testing. The investigation quietly entered its final stage. Detectives began monitoring Neal. By this point, he was living in Colorado. Investigators traveled there without publicly announcing why. Their objective was simple: obtain a DNA sample that could legally be compared with the biological evidence preserved since 1973. According to investigators, Neal discarded an item containing his DNA during surveillance. Law enforcement recovered that item through legal investigative procedures. The sample was submitted for laboratory analysis. Then came the moment detectives had waited decades to reach. The laboratory comparison confirmed that the DNA recovered from James Allen Neal matched the DNA evidence preserved from Linda O'Keefe's murder. 45 years after an 11-year-old girl disappeared on her walk to school, investigators finally knew the identity of her killer. The confirmation represented one of the most significant breakthroughs in the history of the Newport Beach Police Department. Every detective who had preserved evidence, every investigator who had reopened the case, every forensic scientist who had refined DNA testing had contributed to this moment. But there was still one final step. James Allen Neal had to be arrested. On February 13, 2019, investigators arrested Neal at his home in Colorado. He was taken into custody without incident. Authorities announced that the decades-old mystery surrounding Linda O'Keefe's murder had finally been solved. For Linda's surviving family members, the announcement brought emotions that are difficult to describe. Nothing could undo what had happened in July 1973. Nothing could return the daughter and sister they had lost. But after nearly half a century, they finally had an answer. The unknown man who had haunted the investigation now had a name. Following his arrest, James Allen Neal was extradited to California to face prosecution. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence developed through both the original investigation and the modern DNA analysis. The case demonstrated how traditional detective work and modern forensic science can complement one another. Without the original investigators carefully preserving evidence, there would have been no DNA to test. Without advances in forensic science, That evidence might never have identified anyone. The investigation became a national example of how cold cases can still be solved decades later. Police departments across the United States look to the Linda O'Keefe case as another demonstration of the power of investigative genetic genealogy. It also served as a reminder that preserving evidence is one of the most important responsibilities in any criminal investigation. Cases once believed impossible to solve were now being reopened across the country. Families who had waited decades began receiving long-awaited answers. Linda's case became part of that larger story, a story of persistence, science, and justice delayed, but not forgotten. Investigators had preserved Linda O'Keefe's evidence for 45 years before science finally revealed the truth. What do you think was the single most important factor that helped solve this case? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. For Linda's family, the investigation had finally reached its conclusion, but the impact of her story would continue far beyond the courtroom, because Linda O'Keefe's legacy is no longer only about a crime that shocked California. It is also about the determination of investigators who refuse to let time erase the truth. On February 13, 2019, the investigation that had begun nearly 46 years earlier reached a moment many believed would never come. James Allen Neal stood under arrest. For detectives with the Newport Beach Police Department, it was the end of one of the longest homicide investigations in the city's history. For Linda O'Keefe's family, it was the first time they could place a name beside the unimaginable loss they had carried since the summer of 1973. Justice had taken decades, but it had finally arrived. The case also became one of the clearest examples of how modern forensic science can transform cold case investigations. The detectives who originally processed Linda's case could never have imagined DNA technology as it exists today, yet they made a decision that ultimately changed history. They preserved the evidence. Every report, every photograph, every laboratory submission, every piece of biological evidence was carefully documented and protected. Those decisions allowed another generation of investigators to continue where the first had left off. The solution did not come from luck, it came from persistence, from evidence, from science, and from investigators who refused to accept that 45 years was too long to keep searching. Linda O'Keefe's case is now studied by law enforcement agencies across the United States. It demonstrates that cold cases are not forgotten cases. They are investigations waiting for the right opportunity. Sometimes, that opportunity comes through a witness. Sometimes, a confession. And sometimes, a scientific breakthrough that simply did not exist when the crime occurred. Investigative genetic genealogy has already helped solve numerous violent crimes throughout the United States. But every successful case still depends on something much older than technology. Good police work. Evidence carefully preserved, detectives willing to review thousands of pages of reports written decades before they joined the department. The Linda O'Keefe investigation reflects all of those things. It also reminds us why victims should never be remembered only for the way they died. Before Linda became the subject of one of California's most well-known cold cases, she was simply an 11-year-old girl walking to school. She had classmates waiting to see her that morning, teachers expecting her arrival, a family expecting her to come home that afternoon. That ordinary morning should have ended like countless others. Instead, it changed forever. For Linda's parents, her siblings, her friends, and an entire community. Although no legal outcome can erase that loss, identifying the person responsible restored something that had been missing for decades. The truth. For families of unsolved homicide victims, truth matters. It cannot replace a loved one, but it can answer questions that have remained unanswered for years. It can end uncertainty, and it can ensure that history records the crime accurately. Today, Linda O'Keefe's name continues to be remembered, not because investigators refuse to let her case disappear, but because her story helped demonstrate what is possible when determination meets scientific progress. Across the country, families still wait for answers in unsolved murders. Many hope preserved evidence will one day provide the same breakthrough. Linda's case offers that hope. Not every investigation will end this way. But every victim deserves investigators willing to keep trying. At the Silence Evidence, every documentary has the same purpose: to remember the victim, to follow the verified evidence, and to ensure these stories are never reduced to headlines or statistics. Because every cold case began with a real person, someone with dreams, a family, a future. Linda O'Keefe deserved that future. Although it was taken from her, her story continues to make a difference. It has encouraged agencies to preserve evidence carefully. It has demonstrated the value of investigative genetic genealogy, and it has reminded families across the country that even after decades, the truth can still emerge. If there is one lesson from Linda's case, it is this: time may slow justice, but it does not always prevent it. Sometimes, justice simply waits for science to catch up. And when it finally does, the evidence speaks. Linda O'Keefe's voice was silent for 45 years. The evidence spoke for her, and it finally led investigators to the truth. If you appreciate respectful, evidence-based true crime documentaries, consider subscribing to The Silence Evidence. Every view, comment, and share helps preserve the stories of victims and supports the importance of never forgetting the cases that still deserve answers. Thank you for watching. Until next time, every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth.